Welcome to Markers and Milestones. This is where we explore educational opportunities for young men and women beyond traditional college, all from a Christ-centered perspective. I'm Leigh Bortins, and I'm here with my co-host, Jean Liechty, as well as Amanda Kleist should be joining us soon. Today is July 17th, 2023. Thanks, Christine, for producing this, and we're joined today by Keith McCurdy from Liechty and Base Camp in Virginia. Thank you for joining us. Nice to have you,
You're
Keith.
welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
So welcome. So I'd like to give a little context for our listeners. This is Markers and Milestones, like I said, and even though I referred to the college level, we are really interested in what you're doing, Keith, because I think you're helping a lot of families help parents so that they actually are very thriving adults, and through your Live Sturdy program. So could you just tell us more about what you do in Virginia, about Base Camp and Live Sturdy, and just in general, let folks know who you are?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I actually do a couple different things. I've been in the mental health field for more than 35 years. I run a mental health clinic up in Roanoke, Virginia. And I also started several years ago, Live Sturdy. And the idea of Live Sturdy is really helping parents look at how they can raise children, in essence, that are sturdier, that can thrive, not just survive in this world. One of the things we've seen over many years is children that are struggling more and more to deal with the normal rigors of life. We're seeing that evidenced in the highest levels of anxiety and depression we've ever seen among our children, middle schoolers and high schoolers. And so a lot of what I do is directly with parents, help them understand how can we raise our children earlier in life to be able to handle these rigors and be of sturdier stock as they get older. I also consult quite a bit with school systems, Christian classical schools, Christian schools, public schools, homeschool groups, just about how we as a school or an educational system can also engage our students in a way to be sturdier as they pursue their education.
You know, Keith, I see you all over the country. You're at a lot of classical Christian school conferences, but I got to tell you, when we down here at Sandhills Classical Christian School in Pinehurst, we brought Keith in, and I was working on a sermon, 1 Timothy. I was working through 1 Timothy, but I was just mulling over a passage, 1 Timothy 4, where Paul's telling Timothy to put on spiritual muscle, put on piety, exercise yourself toward godliness. And when you were talking about Live Sturdy and how we're actually loving kids to death, almost, you didn't say that, but we're creating a weak generation because we're always trying to protect them from some of the things that God uses to strengthen us. Trial, right? Consequences, and other things. I mean, it was so interesting. So immediately, of course, I loved you. You were helping me with the sermon. I was furiously writing notes and and using some of that like I would a commentary. But a lot of what you say, I know it resonated with our families, and every family that attended and listened to what you had to say about technology, about trials God brings and viewing them a little differently, resonated with our parents to the extent that every one of them wished that they would have brought 4 or 5 other parents. And it's the reason why we're bringing you back this fall. Anyway, so thank you for what you do. It's needed today. Parents are looking for a little assist.
Thank you. And and that's what I run into, and whether it's in my office or whether it's at schools when I visit and have parent forums, is parents that feel very overwhelmed or ill-equipped because the messaging that is in our culture is completely counter to what Scripture calls us to in raising our children. I had a question of an administrator, I don't know, just a couple months ago. It was at a large conference, student conference, and he said, "What's the one single biggest problem in raising our kids today?" And I thought, really, the one? And I said, it's the lie that we've been telling our families. It's a cultural lie that how we feel is the most important part of who we are. what that does, it creates this notion that our feelings should be our compass to life. And yet our feelings are one of the most distorted parts of our daily existence. Our feelings do not always line up with what is true. And so we've told a generation, and about a generation and a half right now, that how you feel is the most important part of who you are, and it should be your compass. Well, when that's the case, then parents believe, oh my gosh, all I have to do is keep my child happy. Well, we've got about 30 years of studying that, and it's a train wreck. The more we try to keep our children happy, the more they struggle with the basic normal aspects of life. Parents ask me all the time, I always think it's a funny question. They say, what's your favorite scripture about parenting? And I usually first say, if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. It's a good cause and effect one. But if you really think about the essence, or what I call the sausage making of parenting, it's not a verse most people think of about parenting. It's the beginning of the book of James. And I'll paraphrase that, but in essence, it's consider it pure joy whenever you face trials. It develops perseverance, perseverance, the ability to kind of stick something out when it's hard. And then it says perseverance must finish its work so that we are complete and mature. And so we get this idea that maturity defined in Scripture, and not just in James, echoed all through Scripture, maturity comes from learning how to struggle well. The engine to growth and maturity is healthy struggle. And that is what we have removed from the last generation and a half to 2 generations of children. We've bought into this mindset about keeping everybody comfortable and happy. And that goes counter to what we know truth to be. If we really want our children to thrive, then they've got to learn to be comfortable while uncomfortable. And that's just not the way most parents are wired today. And so that's a lot of the work that I end up doing. And I think, Gene, as you know, when I came down to visit you guys, the message was very counter what a lot in my profession would share.
Are you finding, go ahead.
No, so do hard things. We find that in the homeschooling community, where homeschooling parents want the education to be just what their child wants and just what they need, instead of having the adults in the room saying, I know I'm homeschooling you because you're part of the body of Christ, and there's a whole lot of things that you need to know how to do that I as a parent can guide you in. We also talk a lot about how if the whole idea of equity is really important to people right now. And for us as Christians, equity means equal time on the cross.
Yeah.
And people don't want to talk about that.
Amen.
Exactly.
That's good.
Yeah, the only equity we're promised is suffering.
That's right. It's interesting with parents. Well, classical conversations is rigorous. We don't apologize for it. Classical Christian education in all its forms, live online, it's hard. We expect kids to we test the limits with kids, and we push, and we get them to do it joyfully and all of that. But the issue most times isn't. It is with some of the kids, but oftentimes the parents are pushing back.
That's right.
The parents are saying it's too hard, and then the kids echo that, right? They're gonna mirror mom and dad. But I think I'm starting to think it's almost the parents get convicted because we're asking the kids to do things and have a work ethic that the parent never had, and
That's
so
exactly
we're dealing with a second generation of sloth. Proverbs has a lot to say about that. Right. Keith, are you finding? 30 years. How is it? 30 or
a little over 35 years in the mental health field.
35 years. Is it getting better, or are you busier? Is your book of business bigger than
it depends on how you define better. If you're in this profession, it's getting better because we're creating more and more patients.
Okay. So that answers the question.
Yeah, it's getting worse. In the social sciences, the field that I'm actually in, in some arenas, the field of psychology is part of the problem. The more of us there are, the worse our populace is. You've never heard a year where we say, oh my goodness, we've rounded the corner on anxiety in childhood, or we've rounded the corner on childhood depression. Every year it's worse. And so why is that? Well, even the field of psychology itself has this habit of overinflating the value of the emotional experience. And then on top of that, when you do that, you get into the realm of subjective truth, subjective reality. And subjective reality, very simply, I'll give you a great example of it, is Gene, I can say you're offensive because I feel offended. So it's all hyper focusing on the self. And we wonder why that's not healthy. The more we have taught individuals to focus on self, the more unhealthy we have become. Ultimately, when you focus on the self, eventually at your core, what you're going to run into is a broken person. You know, that's why God calls us to be others focused.
Yeah.
And we have young children that learn to be contributors rather than consumers, producers rather than consumers. When we learn and develop children into being servers of others and those to help others, they develop capability and confidence. And we're not dealing with this high level of anxiety and depression. But in today's world, that's not the direction we're going. We're creating the consummate consumer. And consumerism eventually leads to, at some point in life, feeling fragile, feeling overwhelmed, feeling incapable.
Yeah.
I remember as a small child, like 6, 7 years old, the first time, I'm old enough, it was the first time on Saturday mornings when there were a few black and white cartoons that they actually marketed some Christmas or some toys for kids for Christmas to the children. And I remember my dad standing up out of his chair, so angry, and saying to the TV, basically, "Thanks for making my job so much harder," because he recognized the usurpation that was occurring.
Yeah.
So it's not been just 30 years. It's been a lot longer than 30 years.
Yes, it really has.
Happening. So do you have advice? Because again, we're aiming in that transition between high school and college. And one thing I've been talking to college leaders about is even at strong Christian colleges, they're getting more and more young folks going to the counseling sessions more than they're going to the grading sessions. But they're wondering, some of them, is it always bad? Because maybe this generation actually is the first generation that's willing to talk about what's going on. Or are they really coming to you sicker rather than trying to be healthier?
If
What's going
this was the first generation that was more willing to talk about issues, and that was a healthy thing, then we would see the numbers going in the other direction. We would see outcome of less anxiety, less depression. The problem is we're not. It's still climbing. The over focus on self, I would argue, has led us to students that are coming that are, for use your term, sicker. I would use the term a little more fragile.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's what we're dealing with. You know, I see in patients that come in my office, I'm seeing children and teenagers come in my office struggling with issues that I would never have seen at this level before. And yet life in every arena is easier for them. Now it's more complex. And we've added more things in as contaminants to their life, social media being a primary one. But it is easier to be successful, capable, a functioning individual in today's world than any other time in our history. And yet we're having more and more difficulty of people being functional, capable, and successful. They're eaten up with more anxiety and depression. So it really has to do a great deal with how we're engaging them as they are younger children. A simple example is, if you go back 100 years, the average 13-year-old male by the age of 13 was a functional young man. Knew how to hunt, fish, farm, help build multiple homes in his community. The average 13-year-old male today, we won't let boil water. You know, so we have removed the actual process of onboarding children to life that prepares them then to handle life when they're older. And so when I deal with high school students, when you're talking about that transition from high school to college, so many of the high school students in my office, I'll give you one simple example that seems to open them up quite a bit. You know, I tell them my grandmother used to have a saying that it's not a big deal unless your head's on fire, you're bleeding out of your eyeball. And they laugh. We all have a grandmother that's like that.
Yeah.
And so I say to them, I say, so I want you to use my grandmother's definition. How many big deals or emergencies have you had in the last 6 months? Almost all of them say, well, using her definition, 0. And I say, okay, how many times have you lost it or gotten upset or panicked when you felt like it was a big deal? And they say, oh my gosh, every other day or twice a week or constantly. And so what they start learning is the difference between listening only to how they feel versus starting to look for an objective, transcendent standard of truth. And so I often get, middle and high school students just to start thinking about all the different times they get upset, all the different times their emotions are running them, to pause for a second and say, wait a minute, I know I feel this way, but is this really a big deal? C.S. Lewis has a great quote in Mere Christianity: surely what a man does when he's taken off his guard is the best indicator of what sort of man he is. So who we are is really not about what happens to us. It's about how we choose to respond to it. And so when students can put the pause in, and they can acknowledge something is difficult or upsetting, but they put the pause in, they actually now have an opportunity to say, wait a minute, I get a choice in how I respond to this. Rather than being just reactionary to my emotion, I can draw in other information. I can draw on wisdom. I can draw on mentors and what they have told me. I can draw on what I know to be, good behavior, and say, how should I choose to respond to this that is so upsetting? That's what we've lost. We've lost that pause to be able to say, wait a minute, what's a healthy response? And so a lot of what I do with students, and even students that will be the ones that go to the counselors in school and things like that, is first get them to assess your emotions are telling you that so much in your life is horrible, but is it really? Are these things really a big deal, or are your emotions overplaying their hand? And it's amazing to me in a very short amount of time how students then can begin to challenge perspective and begin to operate.
And when you say students are, I'm sorry, when you say students, you're talking about students mostly at the logic, rhetoric, upper school students, 6 to 12, on into college.
Yeah, I mean, all the way through. I
all the way through
nationally with a lot of college students on, just college survival and things like that. And these are conversations I have all the time with them. But I also have these conversations with 8, 9, and 10-year-olds, but a majority are with teenagers and young adult college age students.
So I got a question here because I have to leave soon.
Sure.
Amanda, I would really appreciate if you made sure our listeners heard about the wonderful opportunities Keith McCurdy offers. We've been talking about the problem, but I know that he's got some really good solutions that parents might want to be aware of. And Jean, thanks for helping us tonight also. And you guys enjoy.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a joy to be here with y'all. So.
And Keith, we'll be posting this on my website and social media and that kind of thing, so that people can know more about your services. So thank you for letting me join.
And thanks for letting me be late. I do have a question or an observation for you,
Sure.
Keith. And I think as a parent, I first really thought most intentionally about the emotions my kids had when my daughter started having more emotions because her body was in change.
Right.
And so we used to have lots of conversations at that time that said, and you used a word here about your emotions running you. We had a conversation about your emotions should always work with your intellect and your theology, and you should have a strong triangle. That's the mental picture I gave my daughter. And that when one side of that triangle was way out of whack, she needed to stop and take a breath.
Yeah.
So that I don't know if markers and milestones, we talk about the older kids, but I think parents really need to think about when your kids are in that hormonal transition stage and their emotions truly are running them, that is a time that the real tools can be developed that isn't actually totally the rhetoric stage, Jean, or the dialectic stage. It's actually a hormonal chemical thing that's going on with our kids. Keith, could you react to that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, I would suggest to you it starts much earlier than that.
Okay.
That this begins, our children, the time to engage and begin challenging our children and helping them shape how they respond and take into consideration their emotions is right around the age between 2 and 3. That is when children begin demonstrating basic functional mastery of life. They can, they begin being more mobile. They have 3 to 5 word sentences. They're operating more on the world. And this is when a shift happens. Prior to that, the majority of their emotional makeup, in a very simple way, is need-based. They scream and cry because they're hot, wet, cold, hungry, tired. Well, a shift occurs around the age of 2 where their emotional world becomes want-based. The 1-year-old screams and cries because they're hot, wet, cold, hungry, tired. On the other spectrum, the 4-year-old screams and cries because we said no.
Right.
And so we are to engage this process of onboarding our children to struggles and rigor in life and shaping how they understand their emotions at that age. So then when they get to the shift, which interestingly is very common between both concrete and abstract thinking, which
Mhm.
also happens right around the time of pre-puberty, puberty for the majority
Right.
of kids, or for a large number of kids, there is already a template in place
Right.
of how you feel about this is not nearly as important as what you're required to do, or who we say you are, or who you know you are. So that when their emotions begin to be so loud,
Mm-hmm.
they already know this is not what defines me. And then
Right.
the conversations you're talking about, they're even simpler to have because you have already built that framework, that how you feel about
That's
something
right.
is not as important as what's right or what's true. So I
Mm.
think your point is great, but I actually think it
You'd
starts
think it's earlier. Well, I did have a
very
mom who had 9 kids tell me, if you don't solve it between 2 and 4, you're going to have the same problem in their teenage years.
She's very
Good.
wise.
Yeah, well, she
Yeah.
had practice. She'd seen it
Yeah.
play out with that span of
Well,
kids.
it's interesting because as I've dealt with families over the years, I mean, tens of thousands over the years, parents who take this approach of avoiding what we call terrible twos end up having terrible teenagers.
Right. And then you can go have so much more expensive mistakes, right?
Right. Those who engage the terrible twos and say, hey, we are going to engage the battle now
Mhm.
in a healthy way and deal with this now.
Yeah.
And those children, when they're teenagers, have a healthier framework in place. Because it's, in other words, it's not about, I just want to keep you happy now. It's no, I'm going to raise you up now.
Right. So given that all this advice may be in somebody's rear view mirror, and they haven't had this type of conversation, which, okay, let me just say the church should be telling them this
I
during
totally agree.
during their parenting and equipping in the church, because that's actually where the training a child up to know the Lord should have its roots. But
That's
you know,
right.
beside that, so now I'm sitting here, I'm at 16 years old, I'm thinking about what I do next. I haven't got these tools. Keith, I'm wondering, are there really sort of bite-sized starting points for parents at this point to help their kids develop this robustness? Because if you don't do it in a small bite, a parent can't train 16 years out of themselves of parenting, much
right.
less help their kids.
I'll give you 2 or 3 things.
Great.
That is where I start with families of teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
If they're coming in and it's a teenager who is not out of control, but it's a very rough ride.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And the parents can't go backwards. They have to deal with them where they are. Well, number one, I tell parents, you have to move a little gingerly, because remember, you wound them this way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're not just going to cut all the strings today, because that's going to cause chaos.
Right.
The 2 or 3 things I tell parents right off the bat. Number one is you have to be in the right emotional space as a parent. If you don't correct something at the very beginning, then anything you do will just create more chaos. And the analogy I use is earthquakes. Earthquake Richter scale goes 0 to 10. If it's a 1 or 2, you hear about it on the news, you didn't feel it. If it's a 3 or 4, you think a big truck kept driving by your building. If it's a 5 and above, major damage happens. We all have an emotional Richter scale. You know, our brain is here, our emotions are just under it. And anytime our emotions fire up and pass our brain kind of goes into paralysis. It doesn't work real well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anything above a 5 is when our brain goes into paralysis. And the crazy thing is, that's when most of us engage parenting. It's almost as if we mistake it for energy to go do good parenting things. And so one of the first rules I tell parents is, if you want to engage your home differently, and actually I tell parents, if there was only one thing you change that's going to make a significant difference, never again parent above a 5. Anytime you catch yourself at 4 and rising, take a break. Now, this flies in the face, especially of younger children, with a lot of psychology that tells you you have to deal with the problem immediately, right when it occurs. Well, there's no evidence that that's wise. And actually, I would tell you there's tons of evidence of that being foolish. If it's a real problem with a child, will it show up again? Sure, it will. You'll have many other opportunities to wait it out until you're calmer to deal with it. But if we deal with a teenager especially, if we don't take our emotion out of it, all we're doing is throwing fuel on the fire that's already going. And so number one is no longer engage your child in a huff. No longer, when your emotions are fired up, you got to walk away, even if you walk away 10 times, until you are calm, and then you can deal with them in a calm way. So that'd be number one. Number two, I'll give you a 2 and a 3. And when I have a teenager in my office, I say, I'm going to draw something on my board, and I think it's your biggest daily struggle, pretty much no matter what you're dealing with. Now, granted, this excludes students with pervasive developmental disorders or psychosis. Other
Okay.
than that, so 98% of what I deal with, I would say, because those categories are very small.
Mhm.
And what I draw on the board is the definition of the word maturity. And maturity is very simply knowing what's right, understanding the limitation of our emotions, that they don't always tell us the truth. So what maturity in action is knowing what's right. And when I don't want to, I don't feel like it, and it's difficult, I choose to do it anyway.
Right.
That's maturity in action.
Which is also a definition of integrity.
Oh, it
Doing what's
is.
right, even
Yeah.
when it doesn't feel like it's right to do it.
That's exactly right. And I've yet to have a teenager balk at the idea that that's a key struggle in their life. And so what I say to them is this. I said, well, here's what I want to do. I want to have a conversation with your parents. And what I want to suggest to your parents is a relationship between demonstration of maturity and responsibility and freedom and privilege. And they said, what do you mean? I don't want you talking to my parents. I said, well, let me explain the relationship first. And the relationship is this. Your job is demonstrating maturity and responsibility. Responsibility means you have to have them. You have responsibilities and you manage them well. And maturity is you demonstrate that under pressure, you can still keep things together and operate as you should. So wherever maturity and responsibility are, I tell parents to tuck freedom and privilege right under it.
Okay.
So what does that mean? Who really drives the freedom and privilege? And the teenager thinks and says, oh, I guess I do. I say, yeah, that's right. So now do you want me to have this conversation with your parents? Because all I'm going to suggest to your parents is to create that relationship in your home. And that when you are demonstrating significant levels of responsibility and maturity, they need to match that with freedom and privilege. And that simple connection is a great place for parents to start. You know, begin thinking about what are some basic expectations, basic responsibilities that my teenager can have, but I've got to make sure I'm not a parent that just says no. I've got to find big things that are healthy and appropriate to say yes to. And when a family can establish that connection, I've seen some of the worst conflicts in families dissolve and see the beginning of change happening. Another way to explain that to parents is imagine a bullseye, an archery bullseye. And the center of the bullseye is what I call the kid job. And the kid job is responsibility, respect, and school. We can lump most things into that, being respectful in general to your parents, decent attitude, schoolwork, manage it, and responsibilities. And when they're managing that center circle well, they get to go out to the next ring, which is simple, typically in the home freedoms and privileges. Simple stuff, you know, different privileges, having a friend over, having a movie night, but not elaborate things. When they're getting those simple privileges and they still keep that center circle running, they get to bump out to another ring. And that is the more elaborate freedoms and privileges, you know, the extracurriculars, being able to go out and do different things.
Yeah.
And the rule is, as long as they keep that center circle going the way they should, that just keeps expanding. When the center circle stops, all the parent does is shrink it back down again. Another way of establishing that relationship.
Keith, what percentage of your time, because you're engaging people of all ages, you've got children in your office, teenagers, you're helping coach parents. It seems like a lot of it, it seems like most of this stems, it's a parenting issue, and then you're dealing with the aftermath of bad parenting. That's what's sitting across your desk, you know, from you in the office. So what percentage of your time are you engaging parents versus children?
Well, younger children, you know, preteen, it's majority parents, you know, less with the children. Very young children. It's interesting. We get calls all the time at my office that a parent wants to bring in their 5-year-old or their 4-year-old or even their 3-year-old. And my staff is trained to say, I won't see anybody at that age until I first see the parent. And I bring the parents in first. And I would suggest that over half the time, I end up never seeing that young child. And we accomplish everything we need to accomplish. And it's not always because I'm seeing the consequences of parents messing anything up. A lot of times it's parents just not knowing the best way to approach something. And so I get the parents in first. Now, when it's an older child, it's probably, you know, between the ages of say 6 and 10, it's probably 50-50. Work with a kid, work with the parents, work with a kid, work with the parents. When you get into teenagers, it's probably 70-30 teenager, 30% parents, teenager, 30% parents. So as they get older, I have more time with the student. But younger ages, it's more with the parents. But everyone I see, I will always see the parents if they're a minor. I won't treat anybody without also seeing the parents, because the parents are the ones that are tasked with the role of raising that child as God calls them to. And one of the mistakes that's often I often witness in my profession is the professional takes the place of the parent, which is not appropriate. My job is to help the parent deal with the child, but never to undercut or usurp their authority.
Well,
And so
that's
I always keep parents engaged.
even important when you're talking about college students and 25-year-olds. If they always have to have the expert take the role
Absolutely.
to tell them what to do, you aren't preparing somebody for true maturity,
Not at all.
right?
I tell folks in my office all the time, my job is to be unnecessary.
Right.
It is not to create a relationship of maintenance. Now, are there folks that I see for maintenance? Sure. Those are folks often that are in pervasive developmental or psychosis or many different disorders, where they will receive on and off again maintenance counseling therapy for years. But that is a very small number.
Right. So I've been talking to some college people about why is it you have these numbers of increased people taking counseling services? And this isn't a direct answer, but one of the things they're noticing is roommates don't know how to do conflict with each other and resolve it. So they walk into the housing office saying, hey, I need to switch my roommate. And they start to ask a few questions, and it's because somebody keeps the room warmer or colder. And right there, those people are saying these kids do not know how to handle interpersonal disagreement and come to agreement. Is that something that echoes in your world?
Yeah, when you are kept comfortable your entire life, then as soon as you are uncomfortable and someone else is the reason for that, you believe they're wrong, you're right, and you're the victim. And so you reach out for someone else to solve your problem. We see this starting in childhood all the way up through. Anytime, think about it this way. We hear the word entitlement all the time. Entitlement, in essence, is very simply this: I deserve blank, fill in the blank, because I breathe. It's this notion, because I am here, I should deserve whatever I claim that I want. Now, we fuel entitlement anytime the old school version is overgive, spoil the child. But anytime we overcomfort, anytime we over sympathize with the child, when we overdo it, we are giving a false notion that their world will always be fluffy, comfortable, a warm blanket. Now, that's great until they run into something like, I don't know, a kindergarten teacher or a police officer or a roommate. And what happens is entitlement is one side of the coin. You never get it without both sides of the coin. The other side of the coin is victimhood. So anytime your sense of entitlement is blocked, you quickly move over to victimhood side of the coin. And what's the evidence of victimhood? Two things. We begin to blame other people for the problem and make excuses for our role in it. That's the crazy mix we create that we see, like your example in college. And there's a lot that can come from that, and there's a more elaborate process we could discuss, but we don't have the time for that here.
So this gets back to the live sturdy, right?
Right.
We're producing a generation of kids who can't handle normal rigors. They
normal rigors of life.
They don't understand conflict resolution. They don't know how to engage it.
Right.
They've been pacified, and they can't withstand the slightest breeze. So
exactly. If you think about it, we're raising children today that have never been engaged in healthy identity formation. And so there's practical identity formation and spiritual identity formation. You have to have the practical because it builds the scaffolding for the spiritual to hang on and fit as they get older. The practical is built starting at the age of 2, and it answers 3 questions. There are 3 key core identity formation questions. One is, am I valuable? As I stand here today, before I ever do anything, accomplish anything, do I have value and meaning? The second is, am I capable? Can I actually, did God build me to function in this world? Even though I'm broken, is he still going to equip me to function in his creation? And the third is, do I fit or belong in a meaningful way to something larger than myself? Can I actually be of use to someone else? Well, it's interesting because when we onboard children early in life to being of service, we begin answering all three of those questions. Think about the young man I said 100 years ago, by 13 was already a fully functional young adult. We know that he could hunt, fish, farm, deal with large animals, build multiple homes. Again, 13-year-olds today, we don't let boil water. Let's compare those two. Did the 13-year-old young man know that he had meaning and value? Yeah, because people relied on him. Did he know he was capable? Yeah, he had practical capability because he was required to be functional in life. Did he know he fit or belonged to something larger than himself in a meaningful way? Absolutely, because with that capability, he had been required and motivated to help others around him. Well, none of that happens in a vacuum. All of that has rigor and difficulty in it. So that 13-year-old, when he later has a roommate that wants the room a little colder, he puts on a sweater. He doesn't worry about it. The 13-year-old today doesn't have the practical tools to answer the basic practical identity formation questions. And they're necessary because they build this ability to struggle well, to learn how to struggle well in the midst of a broken world, but they also set us up for spiritual identity formation. It's the scaffolding. It's much like thinking about a parable. The parables that Christ told, as we all know, they were practical. They connected to what the people knew: sheep, goats, wineskins, fields. But that
agriculture.
But the practical story gave both the framing and the tools to wrestle with the spiritual understanding. Practical identity formation, answering those three questions practically, by the time a child is 10 years old, gives them both the framing and the tools to wrestle with spiritual understanding as they begin becoming abstract thinkers. And we've lost that. And so that's why you have everybody focused on themselves. They get to college, the roommate wants the room colder, and they don't know how to handle conflict. But we misbadge it because we say, well, all they need is conflict resolution. And it's like, no, there's a reason conflict resolution strategies in college don't work. Because it's not really just learning a technique. It's learning how to be a functional person in this world.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was a long answer.
It was a great answer, and the scaffolding is really true. The other thing is, I would just observe, I don't see parents practice that very much in their own church environment.
Oh, totally agree.
And that means you can't get your kids to do something you don't model real well every Sunday with them, or the way you change churches, or the way there's just lots of things we do that we think our kids don't see, but we're truly modeling those three things you just said. So
we absolutely are.
Yeah.
We're modeling all the time. And if we're going to want to raise our children with those key aspects of life, we've got to be living those aspects as well. And that's why so much of the time when I deal with a child or a child's problem comes in, I first engage parents, because a lot of times the work is, wait a minute, you all need to live differently. If you're not living differently, I mean, you're not going to get, fresh water out of a saltwater well.
Right.
It's not going to happen.
It may not even always, Keith, be live. It may be believe. Those first two components of any parents struggle with, because we're now 2 or 3 generations past that 13-year-old.
That's exactly
that you're talking about. Yeah.
Well, that's why I say we're wrestling in the parenting world. We're wrestling with a generation and a half to 2 generations that have been consumed by this cultural lie about your feelings and about overfocus on self. And so we have, if you think of a school system, we're talking about the parents of our grammar school students. They were raised, unfortunately, this way as well, the majority of them.
Correct. Yeah.
And so we have an audience that in many ways doesn't know better.
Right. They have nothing to practice against. They don't have something to match to. Yep.
That's right. And yet they're following what culture says.
Sure. Every good parenting book.
And it isn't working. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why they come to see me. Unfortunately.
So that's a good segue, Gene, I think, for him to say what his services are and some of the resources he has for parents. Unless, Gene, you have another question.
No, I was just thinking the same thing. Keith, you have a website with some resources on it. Can you just
Yeah,
share
I
a
have
little bit about the scope of what you provide?
Sure.
That'd be great.
Yeah, my services are a whole lot more than what my website is. I have a
Okay.
very simple website as a landing spot, and it seems like it's always under construction. You know, in the Roanoke in Virginia, I run a mental health clinic and actually do a lot of mental health treatment. But nationally through Live Sturdy, I do multiple things, from the smallest all the way up to the largest. I do parent coaching. So parents can reach out to me through livesturdy.com. It's keith@livesturdy.com. And they can sign up for parent coaching sessions where we break down really what's going on in their family and equip them with basic practical things they can begin doing better in their home.
Mhm.
I also do individual coaching with college students. I do some work with collegiate professional athletes as well nationally. I do premarital and some relationship work coaching as well on the website. Nationally, I consult with school systems and businesses, both in
Yeah, you've been
county.
down, like when you come down here,
Yeah.
just and as an example, yeah.
Right. When I come to a school, I visit with logic and rhetoric, middle and upper school students, and have a session with them, have a session training with staff, and then we have a parent forum. I also offer full parenting workshops, which are about 6 hours in length, and do a lot of individual consulting and coaching as well. So it's a broad range of things.
Well, and you've done so much, these podcasts that you've done.
Oh, yeah.
And you may have done them beyond Basecamp Live. That's where I got introduced to you. I heard you at a national conference, and then that connected me to Basecamp Live. And there was just a wealth of resources, just a lot more. You could go into a lot more depth than you can tonight in this short session. And so
Mhm.
there are these resources readily available. More Keith, it's a good thing.
Well, and if you go to my website, one of the things you can do on my website, you can reach out to me, but also one of the links is podcasts. And once this podcast is up, I'll throw the link on there as well. There's probably 25 different podcasts I've done, a ton with my good friend Davey Owens with Basecamp Live. And he does all kinds of podcasts, but I do a lot with him. The Cersei Institute, I've done several with them.
Oh, yes.
Different individual schools have their own little podcast they do, and I'm often on a different school's podcast. Like I said, you guys, once this is up and running, I'll throw that link. And those are all free. Those are all just resources for parents.
Good.
Well, so that was Basecamp Live and livesturdy.com.
Livesturdy.com is my consulting site. And then my good friend Davey Owens with Basecamp Live. That's another site you can go to. And on Basecamp Live, it's not only things that I do, but it's also a lot of other folks in the classical world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keith, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us this evening. What you do, the wisdom God's given you in this area is so invaluable, right now. Guess it has been for 35 years, but it's so keep it up, brother.
Well, hopefully I will, and thank you for having me on.
You're welcome.
Great to meet you, Keith.
Nice to meet you as well.
God bless.
Thanks. Well, we'll see you
Bye.
next time on Markers and Milestones. Have a great week, everybody.